The sound of tires grinding on asphalt was the last thing I expected to hear. Standing outside the house, in the blink of an eye, the world turned upside down, and I found myself lying on the ground. The groceries I just bought are scattered around me. The weight of the body that mercilessly pinned me to the ground made me freeze. My body screamed in pain, acute, unbearable pain in my legs, chest, and head. I tried to figure out what had just happened, trying to collect my thoughts, but my head was empty. All I could think about was how much I was in pain, and how strange it all was, how impossible it was to believe in what was happening. It took me a while to realize that I had been hit by a car. I couldn't immediately realize that I was under the wheels, that I was simply not noticed as another obstacle in the way. And so, when I tried to get up, almost fainting from the pain, the one who caused my fall stood in front of me. It was Lucinda, my mother-in-law. I knew she didn't love me, but I couldn't believe that this woman, despite all her barbs and sarcastic remarks, had gone so far as to knock me down in front of the whole street. The world around me seemed to become blurry. Fragments of thoughts and images flashed in my mind, how Lucinda, with a cold and impenetrable expression on her face, turns the steering wheel, how this wheel, which has now become my enemy, drives through my body. It was as if all this was happening in another time and space, and I became part of some kind of nightmare. In the hospital, lying in the ward, gasping in pain, I tried to make sense of what had happened. A few minutes later, when dark thoughts began to engulf me, the phone rang. I shuddered, trying to catch my breath. It was Fred, my husband. His voice was strained, and his words sounded as if he already knew that everything had not happened the way I could tell it. "Anna, you need to tell the police that you just fell," his words were insistent. "They say that someone saw Mom hit you with a car. Can you believe it?" The impact I felt was stronger than the one left by the car. The pain in his body, of course, did not subside, but now it receded into the background. I was shocked. Not only did Lucinda hit me, but now Fred and his parents were trying to cover it up, turning me into a victim of my own carelessness rather than what actually happened. They tried to make me not tell the truth, so that I would behave like an innocent wife who accidentally got run over without noticing. Fred continued to make excuses, his voice becoming more and more incoherent. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that his mother was an aging woman, that we all needed to be more understanding. But I didn't care. These words, empty and meaningless, sounded like empty excuses. I couldn't believe that this man, with whom I had once built a future, was now turning into a stranger. And then my thoughts, like invisible threads, stretched back to the days when our marriage seemed like a real fairy tale to me. We met in the office when I was just starting my career. I was full of ambition and hope, and Fred was my mentor back then. He wasn't the typical handsome and charming man that my dream could be, but he was reliable, calm, always there. His attention to me gradually grew into something more. He showed no passion, no sudden infatuation, but his stability, his support seemed to me something very important. He was my anchor in a world full of uncertainty. But the tale quickly turned gloomy. As soon as we got married, I quit my job and moved into his parents' house. This decision, which I made then, turned out to be a disaster for me. Life with Lucinda and Cameron was a constant battle. There was no warmth or love in the house, which was supposed to be cozy and native. Lucinda, with her sharp tongue and unyielding demeanor, seemed determined to remind me every day that my life now depends on her son, that I should be grateful for everything. She, with her mouth full of condescension, keeps saying, "You're living a comfortable life thanks to Fred." And every time her words sound as if she was telling me that I am nothing, that all I have is just a gift, for which I must remain silent and obey. Cameron, though taciturn, was no less violent in his views. He's like an old-fashioned ideologue who didn't like that his son's wife wasn't ready to cook dinners and have children. I became just an empty shell for him, with no meaning. My marriage to Fred was becoming unbearable. He became more and more on the side of his parents, and every day I lost hope of salvation. Attempts to talk to him about our problems were met with indifference and reproaches. "You should be more understanding," he told me, as if it was my fault that my dreams of a family were melting away every year. The pressure from Lucinda and Cameron was becoming unbearable, their insistence that we immediately start thinking about children, as if that was the only reason for my existence. But Fred remained indifferent, absorbed in his own world, and it seemed to be even worse. Charlotte, my neighbor, and her husband David were my only consolation. Their house was a quiet refuge where I could come when life outside the doors seemed too cruel and cold. They knew the real story behind the perfect facade of my marriage. They saw all the hidden pains that I had been carrying for so long. Charlotte went through her own struggles and, despite all the difficulties, became the person I could trust. She was my friend, my shoulder. When everything around me was falling apart, when neither Fred nor his parents could or would understand me, it was Charlotte who became the source of strength that supported me. Charlotte wasn't just a neighbor. She was a person who, like me, knew the bitterness of betrayal, but did not break down, did not let these things steal her strength. She had been through as much, if not more, than I had, and now, as I lay in a hospital bed thinking about it all, it was her words that were the anchor that kept me from giving up. Fred's voice brought me back to reality. He was begging, as he always did, and there was something painfully familiar about it. "Anna, you have to do this for us, for the sake of the family." His words sounded like a hammer that tried to put me in chains, but I felt something inside me break. I no longer had the strength to be a submissive wife, a victim of this twisted family dynamic that oppressed me every day, forcing me to believe that my life should only be a continuation of other people's expectations and ambitions. I could no longer continue to live in this vicious circle, hoping that one day he would let me out. I hung up the phone, and with it, the last doubt disappeared. A sense of determination was growing in me, and it was not just a feeling, but a complete understanding that the moment of change had come. They have crossed the line, and now they will have to face the consequences. I was no longer a victim, I was going to fight back. It wasn't just about me, it was about how to confront the injustice that had ruled my life for too long, destroying every moment, every inspiration. In the sterile calm of the hospital room, my thoughts raced like a storm. I struggled with the pain not only of my injuries, but also of the betrayal of those I once called family. This world that I now existed in seemed so alien and cold. I struggled with my own disappointment and the fact that I had to hide my truth for so long. The sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. My eyes were blurred, but at some point I saw Charlotte enter the room. She walked with caution, but I noticed how her face was etched with worry. She sat down next to me, and at that moment I felt her presence helping me to gather myself. "Anna, how are you feeling?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but her eyes betrayed the anger she might have been hiding, but which I could feel. I tried to smile, even though I knew she could see through my efforts. "I feel better," I replied, trying not to betray the pain that was still burning inside me. But the question she asked me next made everything else unimportant. "What did the police say?" Her voice sounded strained. I sighed, trying to collect my thoughts, and told her everything as it happened. How at first they believed in that story of an accidental fall, how I had to tell everything, how I saw Lucinda drive out of the garage with such an angry expression on her face, how when I was on the ground, her car was already behind me. Charlotte clenched her fists. "Does Fred want you to lie to protect them?" She looked at me with fury in her eyes. I felt a fire inside her, similar to mine, ignite. She reached out and squeezed mine. "You can't let them get away with this, Anna," she said, and I heard something in her words that made me believe in my strength again. "It's not just an accident," she continued, "it's years of manipulation and control. This is your chance to break everything and get free." Her words resonated in me, as if they were something I had been missing all these years. I endured Lucinda's humiliating comments, Cameron's dismissive attitude, the old-fashioned views they tried to impose on me. And Fred, who always passively gave in to his parents, making me feel alien in my own home, alien in my life. Now I understood that this struggle is not just a struggle for justice in the family. It was my struggle for myself, for the right to be free from manipulations that led me through life like through dark labyrinths. Charlotte was sitting next to me, and in her gaze I saw the strength that I missed so much. In that little moment, when we both realized that we couldn't put up with it anymore, I felt something important happening inside me. With every word, with every gesture, with every breath, I became stronger. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but now I was ready to fight for my life. It was a cycle of control and humiliation, an endless test of my patience and resilience. Every day, every moment, they were like a test that I had to pass without giving up, without showing my pain. And at that moment, sitting next to Charlotte, I felt like this cycle was finally breaking. We discussed the plan that was gradually forming in my mind. It wasn't just a plan for justice, it was retribution. All this endless pain, all the humiliation that I endured, demanded an answer. With every word, I felt the power filling me. It's time for Lucinda and her family to face the consequences of their actions. The next day, a policeman came to take my statement. His face was serious, but I noticed something more than just professionalism in his gaze. He was determined to act. I told him about all the events that led up to the accident, the pain, the betrayal, and Fred's desperate plea to hide the truth. I told how I had to deal not only with injuries, but also with the cruel, broken, and unworthy behavior of those who were close to me. The officer listened to me attentively, writing down all the words. When I finished, he put the notebook on the table and said they had enough information to start the interrogation. After we finish, we will need to continue the investigation, but your testimony is crucial, he said, and there was nothing but confidence in his voice. I nodded, feeling the flood of emotions that I had been hiding for so long begin to boil in my veins. Now, finally, I could act, and it wasn't just a legal intervention, it was something more. It was the first step towards getting my life back, to restoring my dignity. Every day my determination grew stronger, like a mountain stream that erodes all obstacles in its path. Charlotte stayed by my side, helping me every step of the way. We thought together about what to do next, and it was liberating to be not just a victim, but a person ready to defend their rights. I offered support in expressing outrage at Lucinda's actions, but also learned that David, Charlotte's husband, was watching footage from a surveillance camera installed on their house. The camera was facing our driveway, and David hoped that there might be something useful on these recordings. When he showed me the footage, I saw Lucinda deliberately pointing her car right at me. It was unmistakable proof. If these images get into the hands of the police, they will become irrefutable evidence of what happened. Every day my physical strength returned, but it was my growing sense of justice that truly healed me. It wasn't just recovering from injuries, it was rebuilding my inner world. I was no longer a silent sufferer, suffering in the shadows. I was a woman, offended, but ready to fight back. Ready to expose the vile nature of those who tried to suppress, manipulate, and humiliate me. The wait in the small room of the police station was excruciating. It was colder than usual here, and even though I was sitting waiting to meet the detective, I could feel the tension, like a cocktail of anger and anticipation mixing in my veins. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from determination, from the fact that this moment was approaching, that I would fight for the truth. The door opened and Detective Reynolds entered the room. He was serious, his face showed no emotion, but I noticed a willingness to act in him. He was the one who was determined to see it through. "We've reviewed your neighbor's surveillance camera footage," he began, laying a file of reports on the table. On the screen, I could clearly see Lucinda's car hitting me. Every movement, every detail, everything was captured, and now no excuse, no lie could hide it. It was unmistakable proof. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a burning desire for justice. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It wasn't just justice. It was my right to retribution, to restore justice that had eluded me for so long. What's going on now? I asked, and my voice was firm despite the storm of emotions inside. We will bring them in for questioning, including your husband, Detective Reynolds replied. They will have to answer for this. His words hung in the air. It wasn't just a case, it was the beginning of a new stage in my life, a stage in which I was no longer a victim. As I was leaving the police station, a plan began to form in my head. It was no longer just a desire for revenge or justice. They should have felt the full weight of their actions, all the pain and humiliation they caused me. This could not remain without consequences. They had to face the reality that their violent behavior would no longer remain in the shadows. No, everything has changed now. Later that day, Charlotte called me with new news. The police took Lucinda, Cameron, and Fred away for questioning. Those words echoed in my mind. Charlotte was excited, but I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. The whole area has already talked about it. People couldn't believe that Lucinda, this bravest woman who once felt undeniable, had been exposed. The whole nightmare spread through the city like wildfire, causing a mixture of shock and contempt from those who once respected the family. But for me it was more than just news. It was an excuse for all those years that I spent in silent suffering, hiding the truth, enduring their manipulations. That night I was lying in a hospital bed, and despite the pain in my body, my soul was as calm as ever. I imagined Lucinda's face when she faced her actions, what was ahead of her. When she, this once formidable woman, now cornered by her own deception, realizes that everything she did led to this moment. I've replayed this moment in my head countless times. Each time it was different, each time it brought a small victory. But it wasn't just Lucinda I was going to run into. The most painful thing was the betrayal of Fred, who became for me the one who dealt me the deepest blow. He chose his parents, his side, not me. He did not choose the truth, he did not choose decency, but preferred to go into their lies and manipulations. This wound was deep and painful, and I knew that he had to understand the seriousness of his choice. There was no room for excuses now. I was discharged from the hospital a few days later. My body still hurt, but I felt like I couldn't be broken. At that moment, I knew that nothing could bring me back to the miserable life that was before all this. Charlotte and David were waiting for me. Their faces were full of care and determination. David seemed literally ready to give up the whole world in order to help me. His voice was as hard as a stone. "Anna, we are with you in everything that you need," he said, and I felt the solidarity that I missed so much. That was what I was looking for. I wasn't alone. It was so important that I could barely keep from crying. We were sitting in Charlotte's living room, and that evening we were watching the news. The story of my accident and the subsequent investigation made headlines in the local newspapers. The faces of Lucinda, Cameron, and Fred flashed across the screen, taped up like the faces of criminals. This family's reputation was ruined, and it was as a symbol of their downfall. With every word of the news, I could feel them sinking into the shame they themselves had caused. It was a surreal moment when my personal troubles, those hidden injuries, finally became a public spectacle in front of the whole city. But there was no sympathy in my heart. There was no pity, no regret. This was the beginning of their fall, which they had created for themselves. And I stood on the sidelines, watching them ruin their lives, not realizing that they were the cause of this destruction. And when their interrogation began, the atmosphere in the room was tense as a taut string. Lucinda, Cameron, and Fred were sitting across from me, and I could see their faces playing with fear, anger, and disbelief. It was what they deserved, something they never thought I would do. Their faces were distorted with bitterness, because they knew that nothing could hide the truth anymore. Detective Reynolds was sitting next to me, His figure in the chair seemed a quiet and calm comfort amid the general tension. His presence was like a reminder of the operation of the justice system, which, despite all its flaws, could still come to the rescue. I knew that this moment, this interrogation, would be a turning point in my life. It wasn't just a legal process, it was the redemption I'd been hoping for so long. "Do you understand why you are here?" The detective began. His voice was not stern, but there was an urgent confidence in it. He turned to the three people sitting in front of him. "The evidence is obvious. Lucinda, you hit Anna with your car and then fled the scene. Cameron, you were a witness and decided to keep quiet. And finally, Fred, you tried to hide it all." A mask of defiance appeared on Lucinda's face, but I noticed a flash of fear in her eyes. It was as if she realized that all she had left was to resist, even if that resistance wouldn't help. "It was an accident," she said, but her voice was trembling and the words could barely hide her fear. "I never wanted to hit her." Her words sounded pathetic, but I couldn't feel sorry for her anymore. It was a lie that she got tangled up in and believed in herself. Cameron was silent. He was sitting with his head down, his gaze was directed towards the table, as if he was trying to escape from everything that was happening. Words no longer mattered to him, not after the truth had come to this office. And Fred, his face turned red with embarrassment and guilt. With every word he said, it became more and more obvious that his inner world was crumbling. He realized that he would not be able to hide what he had done. "Mom, why didn't you just stop? Why did you run?" Fred's voice was shaking, and it seemed like everything in his life had suddenly turned 180 degrees. For the first time, he realized the reality of what had happened and the consequences of what they had done. It was the confession I had been waiting for so long. I looked at them, and the storm rumbled in my chest. All these years, all those senseless sufferings that I had endured, could not now go into oblivion. Lucinda and Cameron were the real faces of their cruelty. And Fred. He was just a blind boy who preferred the lies and protection of his parents to the truth that was in front of him. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. "You could have killed me, Lucinda, and all you cared about was saving yourself," I said calmly, but every word sounded like a sentence. "You've ruined me, but you've ruined your own life even more." My determination was so strong that I didn't feel the slightest hesitation. All these years of helplessness, fear, pain, now all this has become clear and undeniable. Lucinda's face turned to stone, but suddenly, as if from behind a shield that she was building around herself, tears burst out. They rolled down her face, ruining her strict appearance. Her voice was full of panic. "I was scared. I panicked," she sobbed, and it became clear to me that she really wasn't in control of her actions, but that didn't undo what she had done. No tears could bring back the lost years. Cameron finally spoke, his voice low, almost unintelligible, but there was something resolute about it, something he hadn't expected from himself. "We were wrong. They are wrong. We should never have lied." I looked at him. It was a revelation, but I didn't feel relieved. I knew that this moment was difficult for him, but his silence and acceptance of the lie also made him an accomplice. He wasn't just a witness, he was a part of it all. Detective Reynolds turned to Fred, and his words sounded like a court verdict. "And did you notice that you were trying to manipulate this story? You even asked your wife to lie for you." He was in no hurry. He gave Fred time to realize the gravity of his situation. "How do you justify this?" Fred's reply was barely audible, as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. "I don't know. I just wanted to protect my parents." Hearing his confession, I felt only disgust and pity. He chose the side of his parents instead of standing on the side of the truth, on the side of me, his wife, the one who once believed in him. It was a moment of betrayal. It was something he chose for himself. I couldn't hold the pain in anymore. "You didn't just betray me, Fred. You betrayed everything we've ever had, I said firmly, with the clear realization that there was no turning back. My voice was harsh, but it was necessary. I couldn't be weak anymore. I couldn't afford to be betrayed anymore. Detective Reynolds nodded, and his face became even more serious as he said, "You will be responsible for all charges. This is a serious matter." When we left the room, I felt an unusual sense of completion. It's as if these years of waiting, torment and silence have finally come to an end. They were exposed. Lucinda, a coward who tried to hide her crimes under a mask of weakness and tears. Cameron, the silent accomplice who chose the shadow of silence over the truth. And Fred, the son, was so blinded by loyalty that he lost sight of what was really important. When I left the police station, the wrong woman came out who came in here. I was faced with what was left of my past, and now, with this realization, it's time to build my future. The air became fresher, the sky more open, and I felt as if the invisible chains that had held me captive for so long had been removed from me. I was free from Lucinda and Fred, from their cool control that watched my every move. My every move was under their supervision. Now that the truth had been revealed and their lies destroyed, I could finally breathe deeply. When I left the police station, I was greeted by Charlotte and David. Their faces were an expression of a mixture of concern and pride, so sincere and real that it became clear to me that they were not just friends, they had become my new family, the island of safety that I had been looking for so long. "You were incredible," Charlotte said in her warm voice, which seemed to be my only source of comfort at that moment. "Thanks," I replied, feeling gratitude that went deeper than just words. They were grateful, silent glances that didn't need words, because they had already said everything. Their support was unconditional, and there was something about it that I could call a real home. In the following weeks, as the legal proceedings against Lucinda, Cameron and Fred gathered momentum, news of the allegations against them spread throughout our community, generating mixed reactions. Some expressed shock, others disappointment, but for me it was a confirmation of my struggle, my desire for justice. When I saw the residents of the city discussing what was happening, I felt like they were no longer afraid of me and did not condemn me, as there was no longer that contempt in their eyes that had haunted me for so long. Now I was on the side of the truth. These days I stayed with Charlotte and David. They provided me not only with a roof over my head, but also an atmosphere of care and warmth, which became more important to me than any material comfort. It was a caring environment that allowed me to heal, to feel alive again, when the years of cold indifference I had experienced with Fred and his parents now seemed so far away and unreal. One evening, as we were sitting in Charlotte's living room warming cups of tea, David broke the news that made me freeze for a moment. The prosecutor's office has begun to consider significant charges against Lucinda and Cameron, as well as charges against Fred for his participation in the cover-up of the crime. There was a bitter sense of satisfaction in my heart. They finally faced the consequences of their actions, and I felt that justice had been served. But there was a shadow of dissatisfaction inside me. My heart couldn't forget how devoted I was. Charlotte looked at me with concern. Her eyes reflected all the questions I was hiding from myself. She, like me, already understood that this was just the beginning, and that I had to decide what to do with my future. "And what are you going to do now, Anna?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I took a deep breath, and this feeling of clarity that came to me after all these months of struggle filled me with an inner strength that I hadn't felt for many years. "I'm filing for divorce," I said firmly. "I can't be with someone who chose their parents over me, even in a serious situation like this." Charlotte squeezed my hand. It was a tacit confirmation that she was with me, in any situation. She didn't ask questions, she didn't offer solutions, she just supported me, and that was the most important thing. The divorce process went quickly, largely due to strong evidence and the assistance of lawyers. Fred was found guilty of manipulating the truth and concealing a crime. The very thought became unbearably bitter for me. I received significant compensation, which was certainly a small consolation for the years of emotional turmoil and mental pain. It was the price for my suffering, but I no longer wanted to think about what had happened. Now I had to think about the future. I rented a small apartment, modest, but only mine. It was a new beginning. It was a place where I could reboot my life and build it on my own terms. There, in this apartment, I felt alive again, although I knew that there was still a lot of work ahead of me. Charlotte and David continued to support me. David, who owned a small business, offered me a job. It was a gesture of kindness, which I took with gratitude. I knew that I was not alone in this world, that there were people who were ready to help, even when the whole world seemed alien and cruel. It was a new chapter in my life, and I was going to go through it with those who really supported me. "You have skills and experience, Anna," David said, his voice warm but firm. "We would be happy if you were with us." I felt how his words touched my heart, how the sincerity of his offer filled the room with invisible support. He spoke from the bottom of his heart, and I knew that his words were not just a compliment. He really believed in me. I nodded, feeling something inside me respond to this offer. Every day I worked with him and Charlotte, I began to realize again that I can do more than just exist. I can build, move, develop. To step into a world from which I was shut out until I learned to trust my powers and new opportunities. In the first weeks at a new job, in the midst of a new life, I felt like a person who, with every step, is becoming more rooted in his reality, feels the taste of independence that he could not get for so long. David didn't just offer me a job, he offered me a chance to return to a life where I could be myself, without fear, without oppression. Charlotte and David became not just friends for me, but real mentors who guided me along the path of self-discovery. I have gained a sense of peace and purpose that has eluded me for many years. Working with them, I rediscovered parts of myself that I had long forgotten, hidden behind the walls of my former life, invisible and faceless, like a shadow. I was no longer Fred's downtrodden wife, I was Anna, a woman with her own personality and strength. I became myself. Months have passed since the trial began, and finally the day came when the verdict was due. I was sitting in the courtroom, and despite all the ordinariness of this place, I felt the extraordinary heaviness of this moment. My eyes involuntarily slid to Lucinda, Cameron, and Fred, sitting on the other side. Their faces expressed concern and regret, but there was something empty in this regret, as if they still did not understand the true gravity of their actions. The judge's voice echoed through the solemn hall, creating an atmosphere of finality in which every word seemed to be a series of blows that robbed them of confidence. The court finds Lucinda and Cameron guilty of hit-and-run and obstruction of justice. Fred is found guilty of helping to cover up a crime. The courtroom was immediately filled with whispers. I felt both bitterness and satisfaction when the verdict was announced. Lucinda and Cameron received prison sentences. Fred was sentenced to community service and probation. It was cruel and fair. There was not just confusion in their faces, but also the full realization that their world had collapsed. The reality of their situation suddenly hit them, and it was something they had been avoiding for so long. After the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse, feeling the sun warm my face. Charlotte and David joined me, their presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the support that helped me through all these trials. It was not just support in a legal sense, but support in an emotional, internal way. They were with me not only in difficult moments, but also in moments when I needed to believe in myself. "Yes," Charlotte said, her voice full of relief, but there was another note in it, heavier. "But at what cost?" I thought about it, looking at their faces, trying to realize the severity of this path. My heart was filled with bittersweet feelings, confusion, joy, but at the same time bitterness for the lost years and the pain I had endured. Justice was restored, but in the process I realized how much it cost me to go through all this. The news of the verdict spread quickly through the city. Lucinda, once a respected figure in our community, has now become a convicted felon. Cameron, her silent accomplice, shared her fate, and Fred, my once beloved husband, became a man who betrayed his wife to protect his lying relatives. Their careers, their reputations, everything was destroyed. In the following weeks, I felt a change taking place inside me. The weight of the past, which had been weighing on my shoulders for so long, began to gradually lift. In his place came a sense of liberation. I could look into the future without fear. I could dream and build without looking back. My life, once defined by the shadows of Lucinda and Fred's control, was now mine to shape. I could choose my steps, and this feeling of freedom became something new for me, almost unexpected. Every day brought something new, sometimes difficult, but always important. Working for David's company brought its own problems and joys. All the undertakings required effort, but this had its own charm. I felt how each success strengthens my confidence, how small victories add up to the overall picture of a new life. Charlotte, always a supportive friend, was by my side. Her words and presence were an anchor for me, which did not let me get lost in this ocean of change. She inspired me not only to work, but also to embrace this new chapter of my life more deeply. There were moments when it seemed to me that old fears might return, that I might find myself back in the abyss from which I once escaped. But Charlotte always found the right words so that I wouldn't lose myself. But the greatest changes happened when I least expected it. It was at one of the company's events that David and his colleagues organized. That's where I first met Ed, one of Thomas's friends, who became my friend. Thomas was a new face in our environment, and I noticed him almost immediately. He was kind, sincere, and, most importantly, he saw me as someone I hadn't been in the past. He didn't see me as a woman overwhelmed by other people's decisions, didn't consider me weak or lost. He saw potential, strength, and confidence in me, which I gradually regained. Our friendship eventually developed into something more, into an affair, which became a real discovery for me. It wasn't the kind of romance I could have had with Fred. No, it was different with Ed. There was no place for betrayal or manipulation. He and I learned to support each other, to trust, to be open. I learned not to be afraid of my feelings, but to open them up to a person who was ready to understand them. We got married a year later. It was a simple but very significant ceremony. Without unnecessary noise and lavish celebrations, but full of the warmth and love that we deserve. On this day, we not only celebrated the beginning of our new life, but also the healed hearts, which, although they could not forget about the past, still learned to forgive. We knew that our path would not be the same as others, that difficulties awaited us, but our bond was the strongest. Thomas knew everything about me, and about my past, about the pain, about the betrayal. But instead of seeing weaknesses in it, he saw the strength I found in myself. When I stood next to Thomas that day, looking into his loving eyes, I realized that this is what a real partnership looks like. It is not based on passionate words or expectations. It is based on mutual respect, support, and deep understanding of each other. This was what I missed so much in my marriage with Fred, a real partnership that did not lose its strength when faced with difficulties, but on the contrary, became stronger. A year has passed since the trial, and life has entered a peaceful rhythm. Thomas and I moved into a cozy house that was ours, really ours. It was small, but it had everything you need for happiness: silence, comfort, space to dream and build a future. We worked on this house, making it the way we dreamed of seeing it. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a place where I could feel really alive. The scars of my past with Lucinda, Cameron, and Fred began to fade. They were not visible, and every day I thought less and less about them. My present was filled with love, satisfaction, which I felt when I woke up and fell asleep in this house. My days became calm. They were not overshadowed by heavy memories, but instead I filled them with new meanings, new dreams. One evening, When Thomas and I were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me with a gentle smile and said, "You know, Anna, I admire your strength. What you've been through is unimaginable, but you're here, and you're stronger and happier than ever." I met his gaze, and in his eyes I saw not only love, but also pride. It was the moment when I realized that all the pain, all the trials that I went through, were not in vain. They didn't break me, they strengthened me. And now, with Thomas by my side, I could walk forward without looking back. I leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his embrace, and at that moment I was overwhelmed by a feeling of immense gratitude. I couldn't have done it without friends like Charlotte and David, who were there for me in the darkest days when everything seemed lost. Without their support, without their faith in me, I would not have been able to find the strength to fight. And, of course, without Thomas, who has become not only a hope for me, but also a part of my new life. My heart is full of gratitude, I told him, and looking into his eyes, I felt the heavy weight that I had carried for so long coming out of every cell of my body. Our conversation turned smoothly into a discussion of the future, to dreams and plans that have yet to be revealed. I have always considered the future to be something uncertain. I have always perceived it with a degree of anxiety. But now, with Thomas around, those thoughts have become filled with light. We talked about the house we dreamed of building, about the trips we were going to make, about the little joys we would have experienced together. Everything seemed possible, and it filled me with confidence. That moment of calm that I felt was a new state for me. It was a world in which there was no place for the past, no place for the pain that I once went through. Sometimes, though, I still heard the news about Lucinda, Cameron, and Fred, even though all these people were now just shadows of the past for me. Lucinda and Cameron were serving sentences for their crimes, and I understood that they had to live with what they had done. Although at the beginning it was difficult for me to imagine how they were going through their consequences, over time I realized that it was their choice. They reaped what they sowed. Fred, on the other hand, was desperately trying to rebuild his life. But knowing that he betrayed me, betrayed us, left him isolated from the community. He found himself alone, surrounded by remorse that could not bring back to him what had been lost. I sometimes thought about him, but these thoughts did not bring me pain, but rather bitter satisfaction. Karma was more than fair to them. When I thought about my journey, about how far I had come, I came to a simple but important conclusion. My story is a story of transformation. I turned from a victim of manipulation and deception into a woman who stood up for herself, who fought for justice and regained her life, now surrounded by love and support. It was much more than just revenge or the restoration of justice. It was a rebirth. And despite all the suffering I went through, I no longer considered it my end point. I was ready to face any future. The hardships and sufferings of my past shaped me, but they no longer defined me. I was Anna, a woman who survived, who found strength and happiness despite all the trials. My journey was long and it could not be erased from my memory, but now, looking back, I saw in these events only the steps leading to my real life. My story will never stop being a part of me, a part of who I am. It will always be a reminder of how far I had to go to find my inner strength, to finally find peace and happiness. But most importantly, I now understood that the present and the future were mine, and I could shape them at will. I was ready to write a story about love's resilience and newfound joy, a story that began not with pain, but with hope and a new life.